What does it take to put a foot on the neck of a Roman emperor? Not just a battle won. The Romans were not defeated on the field that day, not by any honest count of the bodies. Not just a faster cavalry. The Seljuks were lighter and fewer and refused contact for most of the afternoon. It takes a coalition army that breaks from the inside while it advances in good order. It takes a young aristocrat at the rear of the line who has been waiting 4 years for the moment to ride away. It takes a sultan in a black caftan who came north on a different errand and chose to stay. And it takes the basileus of the Romans himself, riding east in the summer of 1071 with the largest field army the empire had assembled in 3 generations, convinced he was about to end the war. By the evening of the 26th of August, in the gathering dust of a plain north of Lake Van, his horse will be shot from under him. He will fight on foot in a circle of dead Varangians, in the gold cuirass that marks him out from 100 paces. He will be taken alive by a Mamluk officer who does not yet know what he has captured. He will be brought, before morning, to a tent he has never seen, and made to lie face down on a carpet while a man he refused to meet at the embassy gate sets one bare foot on the back of his neck. He is in his late 40s, broad in the shoulders, scarred across one cheekbone, the son of a Cappadocian general. 3 years before this afternoon, he had been a prisoner in irons in the imperial capital, waiting on a sentence for treason. Now he wears the purple of New Rome. His name is Romanos, the 4th of that name. The chroniclers call him Diogenes, after his father's family. He is the basileus of the Romans, the sole legitimate sovereign, by the lights of his own civilization, of the Christian world. By morning, he will be in chains. Across the plain on a low rise, a smaller man in a black caftan sits a chestnut horse. He has refused his armor today because he did not expect to fight a battle. He came north this summer to take Aleppo from the Fatimids in Syria, and the Roman emperor's army was meant to be elsewhere, weeks away, lost in Armenia. He has named his shroud out loud to his officers before the line forms. He has tied his horse's tail with the loose knots of a man who is ready to die. He is 41 years old. He has buried 2 brothers and an uncle to get to the saddle. The Persian and Arabic chroniclers call him Alp Arslan, which is a Turkish name and means, plainly, heroic lion. This is the story of the only Eastern Roman emperor, in nearly 7 centuries of unbroken line from the day Constantine raised his walls on the Bosporus, to be taken alive on a battlefield. 26 August, 1071. A plain north of Lake Van, beside a fortress town called Manzikert. The Turks pronounce it Malazgirt. The Armenians, Manzikert. The Greeks of the empire, Manzikert. 3 names for one piece of ground, because 3 peoples are about to lose something on it, and only one of the 3 will know what it has lost in time to remember. The number to keep before the chronicles begin to fight over how many men were on the field is not the size of either army. It is 1. One emperor in open battle, taken alive, on his feet. There is no other instance in Roman history, east or west, principate or dominate, Macedonian, Ducid, Comnenian, Palaiologan, of a sitting Augustus captured this way and made to stand, dust on his cloak, before a foreign sovereign as a defeated man. This is the story of how the basileus of the Romans walked east with the largest field army the empire had assembled in 3 generations, fought the battle he had spent 4 years asking the Seljuks to come and give him, and lost. Not because the battle was unwinnable, but because somewhere behind the imperial center, in the gathering dusk, a man 23 years old turned his horse around. Michael Italiates was inside the baggage train that day. He was a senior magistrate of the army, not a fighter, sent along to handle camp justice, audit the supply trains, and write down what happened. He survived because the baggage moved off the field early, before the encirclement closed. He wrote his Historia from memory and from notes, with a hand he himself describes as unsteady for months. The phrase he uses for the day, when he finally lets himself name it, is the plainest phrase he could have chosen. He calls it the great calamity that befell the Romans. He blames the slowness of the center. He blames the mercenaries who would not hold. He does not, in any sentence I can find on a careful reading, directly blame the family that benefited most from Romanos's removal. That silence has bothered me for 15 years. By Italiati's count, the Roman force on the field was somewhere around 40,000 effective, with another 20,000 or so detached on subsidiary missions before the battle proper. The Arabic chroniclers double those numbers. Ibn al-Athir, writing in the next century, gives figures the manuscripts cannot quite reconcile with the geography of the plain. Matthew of Edessa, an Armenian source hostile to Romanos in any case, pushes the count toward 100,000. The manuscripts disagree. The truth probably sits near Italiati's, give or take 10,000, or 12,000 if you trust Bryennios's unit-by-unit list more than the magistrate's round figure. I lean toward the magistrate. He was on the ground. Bryennios was writing 2 generations later for the Comnenian court of which he was a part, and he had a thesis to defend. What both sources agree on, and what neither says cleanly out loud, is this. The Eastern Roman army at Manzikert was no longer, in any practical sense, an Eastern Roman army. It was a coalition under a Cappadocian general who happened to wear the purple. The Varangians of the Imperial Guard, Norse and English. The Latin cavalry under Roussel de Bailly, a Norman adventurer who had ridden east for pay. The Pechenegs, Turkic horsemen, settled on the Danube 2 generations earlier and absorbed into Byzantine service. The Oghuz Turks, cousins of the Seljuks across the field, in Roman pay this season but not the next. The native Roman regiments, the themes of the East, the Armeniacon, the Anatolikon, the Cappadocian Tagma, the surviving units of the central Tagmata, were smaller than the round number sounds. I have read this paragraph in Bryennios 3 times. Coalitions break under pressure. This one would have its pressure applied from inside. That young man at the rear of the column, the 23-year-old with the Imperial Reserve under his banner, was named Andronikos Doukas. His father had worn the purple before Romanos. His uncle would wear it after Romanos. His family had spent the 4 years of Romanos's reign trying to undo the marriage that put the Cappadocian on the throne in the first place. He had been given the rear guard at Manzikert because no commander can refuse a high-ranking aristocrat a senior command without insulting the family, and because, by some readings, the emperor wanted his most dangerous political rival inside his own line of sight. Hold that name. We will come back to it in the dark, 2 hours after sunset, when the Roman center is encircled and the rear, by every account that survives, is no longer where the rear should be. There are battles in this period I have reread every year for a decade, looking for the seam at which they came apart. Manzikert is the one I keep returning to. Not because the seam is hidden. 3 sources point at the same hour, the same patch of ground, the same family, but because the seam is so small. A young man on a tired horse looks back at the dust where the imperial standard ought to be. He sees, or believes he sees, the standard reversed. He gives the order to withdraw. And 1,000 years of one continuous Roman state, the longest-running political institution any branch of the Western experiment has ever assembled, begins its slow, unforced slide toward 1453. To understand why a single turn of a single horse could undo what Goths and Persians and Huns and Avars and Arabs and Bulgars and Rus had failed to undo across 7 centuries, you have to understand what had quietly been hollowed out under the surface of the empire across the 46 years between the death of Basil II, the last great soldier emperor of the Macedonian line, and the morning Romanos Diogenes buckled his cuirass beside Lake Van. The empire that fought at Manzikert was not the empire Basil left behind. It only wore the purple of one. When Basil II died in the December cold of 1025, after some 50 years on a throne he had had to win 3 times, twice against domestic rivals named Phocas and Skleros, once against the Bulgar Tsar Samuel. He left to his brother Constantine the largest, richest, most disciplined Roman empire any Basileus had touched since Justinian. The Bulgarians were broken. The Fatimids were quiet. The Armenian princes were ringed by Roman fortresses. The eastern frontier ran from Antioch to the Caucasus, along ground Roman patrols knew by every dry stream. The treasury, by the count of John Skylitzes and George Kadrinos, held a reserve of silver large enough that the chroniclers gave up describing it in normal accounting terms and turned to the rhetoric of legend. The army numbered, on paper, somewhere over 300,000 men. 46 years later, on the plain at Manzikert, Romanos Diogenes commanded barely a tenth of that paper number and could not entirely trust the half of it that was native Roman. Something had been hollowed out in the interval. Not in one stroke, slowly, by a series of decisions taken in the council chambers of New Rome by men who had never carried a shield and did not believe they would have to. The first decision was to stop maintaining the themes. The theme, the thema, was the basic military and territorial unit of the Roman East, a province whose peasants held land on condition of military service. It had been the spine of the imperial recovery across the 8th and 9th centuries. By the reign of Constantine IX Monomachos, 20 years after Basil's death, the spine was being deliberately taken apart. Constantine commuted the military service of the Iberian theme to a cash payment. Other themes followed. The reasoning was civilian and rational. The cash filled the treasury. The absence of unruly provincial troops calmed the capital. And the consequence, on the ground, was catastrophic. The native infantry that had held the line against the Hamdanids and the Bulgars stopped existing as fighting formations. By the time Romanos rode east in 1068, the themes of Armeniacon and Anatolicon could not put on the field what a single skirmish under John Tzimiskes a century earlier had assembled. The empire did not stop fielding armies. It stopped fielding its own. Mercenaries were cheaper to maintain in peace, easier to disband at need, and politically less dangerous than a peasantry trained to fight. The cavalry that rode out under Romanos in 1071 was a hiring catalog. Norman heavy horse under Roussel de Bailleul, Latin sergeants from Italy and Lotharingia, Scandinavian and English axemen in the Varangian Guard, Pecheneg horse archers from the Danube frontier, settled there a generation earlier and absorbed into Byzantine service. Oga's Turks who had crossed the river in tribal bands and taken Roman pay because Roman pay that year was reliable. Their cousins, the Seljuk Turks across the field at Manzikert, would call to them by name in their own language. The chronicles do not record what reply was made. Nikephoros Bryennios, writing for the Komnenian court 2 generations later, describes the mood of the late Macedonian afterglow with a quiet, bitter clarity. The court, he says, became suspicious of any general it could not buy. The generals, in turn, learned not to expect support from a city that resented their existence. The young Alexios, the future emperor whose dynasty would, briefly, postpone the consequences of Manzikert by a century, grew up listening to his older relatives complain of being summoned to defend an empire whose ministers did not trust them with horses. I've gone over those passages in the Alexiad and in the Bryennios fragments more than once before letting myself sit with what they imply. The civilian government of the Roman Empire in the decades between Basil II and Romanos Diogenes had taught its own military class to consider itself the enemy. Into that hollow came a steppe people the chronicles had been hearing about for half a century, but had not until lately learned to fear. The Seljuks were originally a clan of the Oghuz Turkish Confederation, named after a chieftain who had converted his household to Sunni Islam, somewhere in the lower Volga or the Aral region in the late 10th century. 2 of his grandsons, Togrul and Chagri, led their followers south into what is now Iran, broke the Ghaznavid forces at Dandanakan in 1040, and within 15 years were the dominant military power in the Islamic East. In 1055, Togrul entered Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph, locked into ceremonial impotence for 100 years, received him not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer. The Caliph was Sunni. The Buyid lords who had dominated him were Shia. Togrul restored the dynasty's ritual independence and was named in return Sultan of the East and the West. The title was new. The arrangement was permanent. The Roman Empire, from this moment on, was no longer dealing with a tribal confederation across the river. It was dealing with an Islamic great power that shared its sense of universal sovereignty. Togrul died in 1063 without a surviving son. Power passed, after the usual succession violence, to his nephew Alp Arslan, the son of Chagri. Alp Arslan was perhaps 33 or 34 when he took the saddle of a sultanate that ran from the Oxus to the Tigris. The chronicles count his age differently, and I have stopped trying to settle which is right. He was an experienced field commander. He had spent his youth fighting in Khorasan and the Caucasus. He had a vizier of remarkable talent, a Persian named Nizam al-Mulk, whose Siyasat-Nameh, written years later for Alp Arslan's son, remains one of the most lucid manuals of medieval governance any tradition produced, and he had an instinct for the limits of his own forces. He preferred to negotiate. The chroniclers, both Arabic and Greek, are surprisingly consistent on this point. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi describes him as a man who offered peace twice for every battle he fought. His armies, however, had a momentum he could not always control. The Turkmen tribesmen who followed his banner did so for plunder, not policy. They moved ahead of the regular forces, raided where the regulars did not intend to attack, and treated truces with Christian polities as suggestions rather than instructions. In 1064, Alp Arslan personally crossed into Armenia and took the city of Ani, the capital of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom and one of the great fortified cities of the Christian East. The chronicler Aristakes Lastivertsi, an Armenian priest writing in the same generation, describes the sack in language he can barely steady. He counts the bodies in the cathedral and refuses to give a number. He records the cross torn down from the dome of the Church of the Savior. He hedges only once, and it is the hedge of a man who suspects he has undercounted the dead. 3 years later, in 1067, a Turkmen warband under the emir Afshin reached Caesarea, the city the Romans called Caesarea, the great trade hub of central Anatolia, 2 weeks' march from the Bosphorus, and sacked it. The shrine of St. Basil was plundered. The reliquary was stripped of its gold. The news reached the capital while the court was still arguing about who should be the next emperor. Constantine X Ducas had died in May. His widow, Eudokia, the Porphyrogeneta of an old senatorial family, had been left as regent for 3 sons. She had sworn before the patriarch not to remarry. Her brother-in-law, John Ducas, was leaning on her to keep that oath. The Turkmen at Caesarea ended the argument. Eudokia broke her oath. The patriarch Ioannis Xiphilinos absolved her. She married Romanos Diogenes, a Cappadocian general she had ordered released from prison earlier that year, where her late husband had put him on a charge of conspiracy, and elevated him to the purple on the first day of 1068. The chronicles do not record what she said to her 3 sons that morning. The empire, in the unsentimental view of its own court chroniclers, needed a soldier on the throne, and there were no soldiers available who were both competent and politically harmless. Romanos was competent. He was not, in any sense, harmless. The Ducas family, including the boy Michael, who was the natural heir, and the brother-in-law John, who was now the loudest dissenting voice in the city, never accepted him. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces, this is what the channel keeps coming back to. The history before the disaster, or the disaster is decided. I will be quiet about that for the rest of the way and turn the camera back to the man on the saddle. Romanos campaigned 3 times between his coronation and Manzikert. In 1068, he crossed into Cilicia, retook Hierapolis from a Turkmen warband, and learned, for the first time at first hand, what fighting these armies actually meant. They did not give battle. They burned the country he passed through and reappeared behind him. He chased them across northern Syria with diminishing returns and came home to find his court colder than he had left it. In 1069, he marched into Upper Mesopotamia, lifted the siege of Edessa from one Turkmen force, and was raided by another in Cappadocia at his back. The campaign cost him his reserves and a winter at Sebastea eating preserved oxen. In 1070, ill and exhausted, he gave the eastern command to Manuel Komnenos, older brother of the future emperor Isaac, and stayed in the capital. Manuel was captured in his first major engagement. He was treated honorably by the Seljuk emir who took him. He was, in fact, allowed to negotiate. He came home with a Turkish embassy in tow, proposing a long peace. Romanos rejected it. He had learned the wrong lesson from 3 years of failed campaigns. The lesson he took was that the Turks would not stand and be fought, and that the only way to fight them was to force one decisive battle by marching east in such overwhelming strength that they had no choice but to give it. He spent the autumn and winter of 1070 building that army. He drained every theme and every imperial treasury he could reach. He hired everything that could ride. He stripped the western garrisons. He left the Danube frontier with the equivalent of a peacetime watch. By March of 1071, the army was assembled at Constantinople. By the end of April, it had crossed the Bosporus. By the beginning of August, it stood in the upland country east of Theodosiopolis, the fortress town the Armenians call Karen and the modern Turks Erzurum. On the edge of the world, the chronicles still call, with the half-flattery of formal imperial geography, the lands of the Romans. The wind there in August is sharp and dry. The grass is already yellow. Cold comes down from the Pontic ridges at sundown, so fast a soldier in a wool tunic cannot keep it out. Romanos's tent was a campaign tent, not a court tent, and the sources mention him sitting in it past midnight, in a cloak heavy with road dust, dictating orders to a notary. He was tired. He was also, by every reading I trust of Italiates and Bryennios both, certain that he had finally maneuvered Alp Arslan into the position where the Sultan would have to stand. What he did not know, what no source available to him could have told him, was that Alp Arslan was within 4 weeks' ride with the main field army of the Seljuk Sultanate, and had been moving north not because he wanted to meet Romanos, but because his own intelligence had told him the Roman emperor was somewhere else. 2 armies, neither expecting the other in the place they would find each other. One commander in the saddle of a sultanate, one in the saddle of an empire he had hollowed out to bring himself here. 3 weeks from a piece of ground neither man had named in his orders, but which both of them, by the last week of August, would be standing on. The first thing Romanos did on reaching the Lake Van country in the 3rd week of August was divide his army. He sent a strong detachment south toward the fortress of Cleot, the great Roman base on the southern shore of the lake, with orders to secure the supply line back to Mesopotamia. He gave the command to Joseph Tarquiniotes, an experienced general, and attached Roussel de Bayeul's Norman heavy horse and a sizable contingent of mercenary infantry. By Bryennios' count, this force was nearly half the field army. By Italiates' count, it was perhaps a third. They marched south in good order on the 22nd of August. They never returned. The chronicles disagree on what happened to them. The Greek sources say they were defeated in a sharp engagement by a Seljuk vanguard and broke. Matthew of Edessa, working from local Armenian rumor, says they were caught at the head of a long defile and surrendered without fighting. The Arabic sources, and this is the version I find hardest to dismiss, say that Roussel de Bayeul, the Norman in Roman pay, accepted a private offer from a Seljuk emir, took his Latin horsemen out of the line, and rode west to set up his own independent lordship in the Armeniacon theme. He would, in fact, do exactly that within a year. Whichever version is closest to the truth, the practical effect on the morning of the 26th was the same. Half of Romanos' field army was simply not on the field. Manzikert itself fell easily. The Roman vanguard reached its walls on the 23rd of August. The Turkmen garrison surrendered after a short bombardment. The Basilefs rode in through the broken gate and dictated a letter to the capital announcing his first concrete victory. The letter was still in the courier's saddlebag when, on the morning of the 25th, Roman scouts at the eastern edge of the plain came back hard, in poor order, reporting clouds of dust on the horizon. The dust was the main field army of the great Seljuks. Alp Arslan was 3 hours away. He had moved up the country with about 30,000 horse. The figure Sibt ibn al-Jawzi gives, and the one most modern historians have settled on, against earlier and wilder estimates. He had with him an embassy from the Caliph al-Qaim of Baghdad, whose function was to mediate. He sent the embassy across the plain to Romanos that afternoon under a green banner of safe conduct. The terms it carried were unsentimental and, by the standards of the moment, generous. The Sultan would withdraw. He would renew the existing treaty of 1069. He asked for nothing the Romans had not already conceded in writing. The embassy was led by a senior Sunni cleric, whose name Sipt records as Saad al-Dawla. Romanos refused. The phrasing of his refusal varies in the sources. Italiates makes it terse and military. The Basileus said his answer would be given in the morning by the army. The Arabic chroniclers give it the flourish of a court rebuke, that if the Sultan wished peace, the Sultan could come to the imperial tent in person, on foot, and ask. Either way, the embassy rode back. The cleric, by Sipt's account, reported the answer to Alp Arslan and added one private observation, that the emperor's confidence was beyond what the field warranted. The Sultan, who had spent the morning fasting and praying in the Hanafi manner, dressed in white, mounted his chestnut without armor. He told his officers he would either win the battle or die in the field, and that they were to bury him where he fell. The chronicles do not say what Romanos was wearing when he dressed for that same dawn. The omission has bothered me. The army that drew up at first light on the 26th of August was the army of an empire built around a personal decision. The center, the imperial tagma, the Varangian guard around the basileus, the bulk of the surviving theme infantry, was under Romanos's own command. The left wing was given to Nikephoros Bryennios the Elder, an able officer and the grandfather of the historian. The right wing was given to Theodore Aliates, a Cappadocian. The rear, the imperial reserve, the strategic mass on which any disengagement would depend, Romanos handed that command to Andronikos Doukas. He gave it to him knowing exactly who he was. He gave it to him because no general could refuse such a command to such a family without insulting the city. He gave it to him because, by Italiatus's reading, he believed he could outfight the Doukas boy if Doukas broke faith. He gave it to him because there was no one else to give it to, and because the basileus, on the morning of the day his throne would be lost, had run out of choices that did not involve standing on a Doukas in some way. The Seljuks fought the battle the Romans expected them to fight, only better. They refused contact. Their light cavalry circled the wings, loosed arrows from the gallop, drew off, came back. They feigned retreat on 3 separate occasions before noon. Each time the Roman line moved forward to engage, the Seljuks dissolved and reformed at a distance. The empire's Pecheneg horse, settled on the Danube 2 generations earlier, raised in the Christian rite, paid in Roman silver, were sent out to harass the Seljuk left. By the Chronicle of Italiatus, the Pechenegs heard their own language called across the dust by Oghuz Turks in Seljuk service. By mid-afternoon, a sizable number of them had simply ridden across and joined the other side. The Chronicle does not tell us how many. It tells us the line on that wing thinned, and that no one at the center noticed in time. For 5 hours, the Roman army marched forward across the plain in disciplined ranks without ever closing on a meaningful enemy. By late afternoon, the sun was behind the Seljuks and the dust was in Roman faces. The water carriers had run out at midday and not been resupplied. The horses were tiring. Romanos finally gave the order he had been postponing, to halt the advance and march back to camp before nightfall. The imperial standard was reversed, which was the standard signal for an orderly withdrawal. The signal was sent down the line. It was the signal Andronikos Doukas had been waiting for. What he announced behind the rear, the chronicles record differently in different sources. And this is where the historiography of the day branches sharply. Sparos Vrionis, in his work on the decline of medieval Hellenism in Anatolia, argued plainly and forcefully that the young Doukas saw the reverse standard, knew that the Basileus was about to extricate himself in good order, and chose that exact moment to ride away, broadcasting that the emperor was defeated and the army should disperse. Vrionis read this as deliberate political treason, a coup carried out on the battlefield by a faction that had spent 4 years preparing for it. Jean-Claude Chenet, in a corrective essay published a decade later, has read the same evidence and concluded that Andronikos was following the letter of Byzantine doctrine. When the center turns toward camp at dusk, the reserve covers and falls back behind it. Chenet does not exculpate Andronikos. He allows that the young man chose the more selfish of 2 defensible readings, but he denies that there was a coup in the saddle. I have spent years moving between these 2 readings, and I lean toward Chenet. The doctrine is real. Andronikos was 23 and had no field experience to override it. He did what an unimaginative officer of his class would have done. The unimaginative officer of his class did not, however, share a surname with the man whose throne would benefit. Both things were true at once. The popular reading is Vrionis's, because the popular reading needs a villain. The likelier reading is Chenet's, because most disasters do not need one. Whichever you accept, the consequence was the same. The reserve left the field, the encirclement closed. The Roman center, halted in the open plain by the unexplained absence of the rear, was hit on three sides in fading light by Seljuk cavalry no longer feigning anything. The wings broke. Bryennios the Elder was wounded, covering the retreat of his men, and would survive. Theodore Aliates, on the other wing, was unhorsed and killed. The Varangians around the Basileus closed up and fought as they had been bred to fight. Romanos's horse was shot from under him. He took a wound in the right hand from a sword cut that Ataliates describes by the small detail of the broken metacarpal bone the chroniclers later examined when his body was brought home. He fought on foot. He was taken by a Mamluk officer of the Sultan's guard, whose name the Arabic chronicles record as Shadhi. Romanos did not announce himself. He was a man in a gilded cuirass without a horse, fighting on a piece of ground covered in dead Varangians, and the Mamluk did not know what he had captured until a Roman prisoner identified the Basileus the following morning. Until that moment, the Sultan's officers had assumed the emperor was already dead in the rout. Alp Arslan ordered Romanos brought to his tent. There is no scene in the political history of the Christian Roman Empire that has been described in the chronicles with more care and more contradiction in the detail than what happened in that tent on the night of the 26th of August. The Sultan, by Sibt ibn al-Jawzi's account, ordered the Basileus to lie face down on the carpet, set his own bare foot on the back of Romanos's neck, and held him there for the time it takes to say a short verse. Ibn al-Athir, working from older sources, gives the same ritual, but adds the detail of a thin, braided cord placed around the emperor's neck, by which the Sultan led him 3 paces forward, as the Persian shahs were said to have done with defeated kings. The Greek sources omit the foot and the cord and proceed straight to the dialogue. Bryennios records that part with the formality of a court speech. Ataliates records it as a soldier remembers an officer's words. The dialogue is consistent across the sources in a way the ritual is not. The Sultan asked the emperor what he would have done with the Sultan had their positions been reversed. Romanos answered without hesitation. He said he would have killed him. The Sultan said, by every chronicler who records the exchange, that his own punishment would be far harder than that. He then released the emperor, embraced him in the manner of equals, and seated him at his right hand for the evening meal. The ritual of submission was completed, and the ritual of restoration was begun in the same hour. Romanos remained in Seljuk hands for 8 days. Bryennios is explicit on the number. During those 8 days, a treaty was negotiated. Its terms, by the version Ataliates preserves, were a ransom of 1.5 million gold coins, an annual tribute of 360,000, the cession of Antioch and Edessa and Manzikert and Hierapolis, and the marriage of one of Romanos's daughters to one of Alp Arslan's sons. They were not, by the standards of the 11th century, ruinous terms. They were the terms of a sultan who believed he had defeated a single Roman army, and not an empire, and who wanted the empire to remain a working state so that the treaty could be enforced. The sultan, before releasing the Basileus, returned to him the imperial seal ring